From brain fog to mood swings, food sensitivities are a huge contributing factor to slumps in your mental cognition as well as your mood. So if you're someone with an intuitive sense that you may be having food reactions, but you're unsure how to define or identify it, then this video is for you. Hi, I'm Jess. I'm a clinical nutritionist, and today's video is all about food sensitivities and your mental health. If you watched last week's video, we went over the gut-brain axis, which is essentially the connection between your gut and your brain. So if you haven't watched that, I highly recommend it. And for those of you that have, you may have an inclination as to how digestive distress would potentially cause disruptions in your mood via this axis. But something that's incredibly fascinating about food sensitivities is that they don't just cause digestive distress. They can cause all sorts of reactions like congestion, joint pain, fatigue, but honestly, the most common symptoms that I see other than digestive reactions, both in myself and a ton of people that I worked with, are often neurological related, affecting that mental cognition as well as your mood. As always, we're gonna dive into some science in this video, but if you stick around, we'll also discuss some strategies for addressing food sensitivities that actually have nothing to do with food sensitivity testing, which I'm actually not a fan of, but more on that later. We're gonna quickly go over how to classify different types of food reactions, like an allergy versus an intolerance versus a sensitivity, just so you can have the right language moving forward. This is gonna help you speak to people about this who may not completely understand or may even gaslight you in some circumstances, but will also help you seek out providers to help you with this if needed. There are 3 different types of food reactions, the first one being a food allergy. Food allergies are IgE-mediated food reactions. So this is where antibodies bind to immune cells and histamine is released. This could be mild to severe, but it's often more associated with those more severe symptoms like asthma, rashes, hives, and anaphylaxis. Essentially, these food reactions are life-threatening. If you have a food allergy, you're probably aware of this. It's likely something that got diagnosed at a young age, like a peanut allergy is a really good example of this. The next type of food reaction is actually referred to as a food intolerance. Food intolerances are metabolic disorders that results from the absence or abnormality of an enzyme, possibly digestive or liver, and/or its cofactors, which results in the inability to process a nutrient or to clear a compound from the body. These reactions are actually non-immune mediated intolerances. So a common example of this would be a lactose intolerance, which you would have a lactase deficiency, or hereditary fructose intolerance. Some of these more rare food intolerances, other than lactose intolerance, is often something you would be aware of from a young age, like the hereditary fructose intolerance. Food sensitivities, which we're going to talk about today, are also an immune response, but they're not IgE mediated, meaning that we're not going to have those IgE reactions like anaphylaxis. They're actually IgG mediated, which involves antibodies when symptoms can appear several hours up to several days after eating a food. These are the reactions that we're going to discuss in more detail. So how do food sensitivities cause a host of different reactions in our body, specifically those neurological reactions? Well, to understand this, we have to understand what triggers food sensitivities themselves, which is generally some degree of intestinal permeability. This is often what's referred to as leaky gut in layman's term lingo, although I actually think that the permeability makes a lot more sense. Intestinal permeability leads to food sensitivities because it allows undigested food particles to pass through the intestinal lining into the bloodstream. Normally, the intestinal lining acts as a barrier, selectively allowing nutrients and electrolytes to pass through while preventing harmful substances from entering the bloodstream. However, when the intestinal lining becomes damaged or inflamed, the tight junctions between the cells essentially loosen and allow those molecules to pass through. This can trigger an immune response as the body recognizes these substances as foreign, that they shouldn't be there, and potentially harmful. Over time, the exposure to these foreign substances leads to or can lead to the development of food sensitivities as the body becomes sensitized to particular proteins in these foods. As a result, even small amounts of these foods can trigger an immune response and produce symptoms such as inflammation, digestive distress, or these neurological symptoms because of the damage that's done to the blood-brain barrier. Intestinal permeability and the blood-brain barrier are connected through the communication that happens via the gut-brain axis. So just like we have our intestinal lining that acts as a barrier, the blood-brain barrier is a protective barrier that separates the brain from the bloodstream and helps regulate the entry of nutrients and other substances into the brain. The immune cells and inflammatory molecules that are activated in response to intestinal permeability can travel to the brain, contributing to damage and ultimately the permeability of the blood-brain barrier, allowing substances that would normally be kept out of the brain to enter. This leads to inflammation and oxidative stress in the brain, which ultimately can result in those neurological symptoms like brain fog, headaches, and mood disorders. This really awesome study summed up this connection pretty succinctly, stating that defects in intestinal permeability may underpin the chronic low-grade inflammation observed in disorders such as depression, and the gut microbiome plays a critical role in regulating intestinal permeability. So what do we do about these food sensitivities? Earlier I mentioned that I'm not really a big fan of food sensitivity testing, and I can make a whole separate video on why, but I'll quickly summarize it with a few points. One, there's been several issues with sampling with a variety of very popular brands where people have sent off samples of themselves on different days and have gotten different results, or sent samples on the same day to different labs and have gotten different results. But even if that wasn't the case, I just think that a lot of these tests are completely missing the point. In my opinion, these tests are really just an indicator of how bad your intestinal permeability is. If you think about this for a second, if you're eating a lot of foods and your intestinal permeability is pretty severe, pretty much all the foods that are going to show up on one of those tests are all the foods that you're eating, because those are the foods that are getting through into your bloodstream. So oftentimes this just causes a lot of psychological stress regarding food, and that's actually the one reason why I'm not really a fan of these tests. If you take one of these and you have a list of food sensitivities that aren't necessarily just the heavy hitters and inflammatory foods, but are actually classes of healthy and healthful foods, and then you start avoiding those, this could lead to some significant or severe nutrient deficiencies, as well as just that psychological stress and food fear that it creates. So what do we do instead? Well, I can't give you medical advice because I'm not your nutritionist and I don't know your situation. What I can tell you is what I would personally do if I was in this situation, and also what I've seen worked for a lot of people even outside of my clients, which is essentially eliminating some foods and also working on some gut healing components at the same time. Let's start with the food elimination part, because there's a few different strategies that you could take. The first is to just go with the heavy hitters like gluten and dairy, or you can do the top 4 heavy hitters, which are gluten, dairy, corn, and soy, and essentially eliminate these foods for at least 30 days. After you eliminate these foods, you can essentially see how you feel, and if some of these like mental cognition issues or mood disturbances start to dissipate. If you're unsure if it's helping, then after 30 days you can reintroduce some of those foods and see if you have any strong reactions. If you're interested in doing a more comprehensive elimination and reintroduction diet, then I highly suggest that you seek out a nutritionist or natural medicine provider to help guide you through this process. And this is for several reasons. There's a lot of time and energy and effort that goes into this. So if you're gonna do it, you wanna make sure that you're doing it correctly. You wanna have guidance and support, someone that you can ask questions to. And then lastly, you're just gonna wanna have someone that you can troubleshoot things with, and someone that can actually help you make sense of your experience, the symptoms that you have or you don't have. Now let's talk about that gut healing part. Gut healing is something that can seem very overwhelming and is, yes, best facilitated through or with a skilled practitioner, but there are absolutely steps that anyone can start taking to not only improve their gut, but start to heal that intestinal permeability. I went over a list that are incredibly important for gut health in the gut-brain axis video, so definitely check that out if you haven't. But the 3 nutrients that are really important for healthy barrier function are glutathione, L-glutamine, and L-glycine. Glutathione is the primary antioxidant made in our bodies, but it's actually our intestinal antioxidant as well. And glutathione is actually made up of L-glycine, L-cysteine, and L-glutamine. Amino acids glycine and glutamine have both been shown to protect and stimulate growth of the small intestinal mucosa. And these are amino acids that are found on fattier skin and bone meats, essentially in collagen and bone broth, which is why bone broth is so gut healing. You can get a lot of glycine from those traditional meat-on-bone foods that I just mentioned, but if there was going to be one nutrient that I really wanted to focus on or supplement with, this would actually be L-glutamine. And this is because L-glutamine is the primary fuel source for enterocytes. And enterocytes are the cells in the intestinal lining that actually make up the tight junctions. So if the enterocytes aren't being fed, they aren't going to function as they should. So L-glutamine is really a great nutrient to focus on because it's needed to make glutathione, it's great for healing intestinal permeability, and also when we are sick, injured, or have a lot of stress, glutamine is actually shuttled to the immune system, which ends up starving the enterocytes. So like I mentioned before, if there's going to be one nutrient that someone could really benefit from in terms of taking an additional supplement, L-glutamine would be a great one. If you're interested in learning about more advanced gut healing strategies, then absolutely let me know. I also really want to say that the point of this video is not to blame everything on food. Food sensitivities can sometimes be a slippery slope for people. Sometimes you may just have a headache because you didn't drink enough water, and Karen is also being particularly annoying today. So not everything is a food reaction. So the point of the video is not to create that mindset, but this is to first and foremost validate you if you do feel as though you may be having some of these types of reactions that could be contributing to your mental cognition. Second, it's important to understand this process so that you can see and be expanded by the fact that these reactions can be improved and in some circumstances completely resolved depending upon the path that you choose to take. If you enjoyed this video, then check out this one. Next week, I have a video on magnesium and its role in anxiety, so if that's a topic that interests you, then hit the subscribe and notification bell so you'll be notified when that video is available. I'll see you next time.